Over the next kind of length of a pint or so, I will talk to you, I guess, about AI and weaponry. This is Ahmed Al-Sabouli, and this is Abdallah. They are subsistence farmers, and they live in a village in Yemen's Al Baida province. In September of 2012, an American drone hit a shuttle of shoppers going to market, killing 12 civilians and absolutely 0 militants. This is Faisal bin Ali Jaber. During the celebrations for the wedding of his eldest son, his brother-in-law, Salim, gave a sermon. His sermon denounced al-Qaeda, denounced militancy. He said it was spreading a cancer of violence across Yemeni society. And he said that everything that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was doing was totally contrary to Islam. A couple of days later, a couple of young men unknown to the villagers come and ask to speak to Salim. Salim goes down with a local policeman, speaks to the men. An American drone kills them all. We investigated tons of strikes like this, very well documented cases of attacks on innocents, and we started to ask ourselves, how did it happen? Why do these kinds of mistakes keep getting made? My name is Corey Kreider. I'm a human rights lawyer. Faisal bin Ali Jaber was my client. In 2013, I set out to understand how members of Faisal's family could be killed by mistake by the United States. But what I found goes far beyond drone strikes in Yemen. Targeting by data analysis, by what's called machine learning, is just one small part of how computers order the world. From the way we work, to healthcare, to how we're policed, artificial intelligence is raising urgent questions about the balance of power and our power to challenge it. This is the world according to AI. There's a lot of debate and a lot of hype about AI these days, but we're not talking about just self-aware computers, are we? It's not just being used, is it, to kind of win at chess or win at Go or translate a document, is it? It's being used to kind of predict things about all of us.
The way we talk about AI now is the way people talked about patent medicines at the end of the 19th century. There were things that were actually medicines, but at the same time, people were pressing the oil out of snakes, mixing it with opium and buffalo dung and selling it as medicine.
Communities, particularly vulnerable communities, children, people of color, women are often characterized by these systems in quite misrepresentative ways.
Marginalized communities are experimented upon, and they're on the front lines of these technological systems, the front lines of harm. They are also on the front lines of rebellion and refusal.
In 1941, the world was at war. Germany and the Axis powers looked to have the upper hand against Allied forces. One of the advantages that gave the Nazis a crucial edge was secret communications. The Germans used an encryption device called the Enigma machine to encode their messages. Cracking Enigma was difficult and time-consuming, but if encrypted messages could be decoded quickly, it could lead to a decisive shift in the war. The Allies desperately needed a faster decryption machine. Spearheading the drive to build one was British mathematician Alan Turing.
The origins of AI as we know it today was during the Second World War, with Turing's work on the Enigma machine. Turing was the first one, really, to think about the idea of the computer as a thought machine, a machine that could think like a human.
Turing built a device using new electromechanical technology that increased the rate at which intercepted messages could be decoded. It was a huge breakthrough, accelerating the Allied victory, bringing forward the end of the Second World War, and marking the beginning of machine intelligence.
Artificial intelligence really was growing in Britain under the name machine intelligence. And in the US, there were starting to be a small number of people who were really getting involved in this, seeing this as an important thing for the future. In 1956, in the summer at Dartmouth, a workshop was held, and it was run by people like Marvin Minsky, John McCarthy, and that event really was sort of the American birth of artificial intelligence. And in fact, the term artificial intelligence was used in their proposal. So that's really where the shift from calling it machine intelligence to artificial intelligence happened.
Marvin Minsky was an American mathematician and cognitive scientist. His friend John McCarthy was a professor of mathematics at Dartmouth College in the US. It was at Dartmouth in 1956 that McCarthy organized a summer-long research project focusing on machine intelligence. It would become part of AI folklore and the place where the term artificial intelligence was first coined. It would also bring it to the attention of the US military.
In those days, the military was the principal source of funding for computer science research. And if you went in to the funders and you said, you know, we're going to make these machines smarter than people someday, and whoever isn't on that ride is going to get left behind, and big time. So we have to stay ahead on this. And boy, you got funding like crazy.
As the Defense Department took over more of the funding, the question started to be asked, but what can we do with it now?
The U.S. Department of Defense had its own research arm called the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. The push for developing AI was driven by the logic of the Cold War. Any technological advantage America could get over the Soviet Union was pursued through ARPA. The new field of artificial intelligence was flush with money and confidence about what it could achieve. But there were competing ideas about how AI would lead the way to this brave new world.
From the very first day, there were two big approaches. One of them was, we're going to figure out the rules, and we're going to teach the rules to the machine, right? We're going to say, this is how you do this. First do this, first do that, first do that. So the first one is the so-called expert systems, where you just codify all the rules you can and say, go for it. The second one was, we're going to show it things. We're going to feed it data, and it's going to learn from the data. You feed it the data and expect it to build what people call a neural network, which is that it looks at the data and the results and says, this goes together, and then does it again and does it again until it builds almost like a brain-like structure.
What happened was a book was published, actually, by Marvin Minsky and one of his colleagues, that basically showed that these neural networks could not really learn certain things. What's typically happened in AI is something comes along that makes us start to doubt a piece of technology. And that causes it to sort of go underground for a while the other stuff gets more attention.
Development of neural networks slipped into the shadows of AI research as expert systems took center stage and all the money. But by the early 1970s, the great advances promised by artificial intelligence had failed to materialize. A clumsy robot, aptly named Shaky, and rudimentary processing machines fell way short of what the early AI visionaries had sold to their backers. For the US military, AI had lost both its appeal and its purpose.
It caused what you call the AI winter, which stopped AI funding for quite a while.
The so-called AI winter would freeze state-sponsored development of artificial intelligence for over 2 decades.
chess, the number of board possibilities is just astronomical. There's so many possibilities in chess that by the 20th move of a chessboard, there are more possible ways the board could look than there are molecules in the universe.
Chess, a measure of human intelligence for centuries, had become a benchmark for how far computer technology had progressed and a proxy for how smart computers could be. With state money frozen, private companies such as IBM funded their own development of AI.
And we do have Kasparov entering the room.
In 1997, IBM engineers built a computer that took on world champion Garry Kasparov in a series of chess matches. They called this computer Deep Blue.
This is amazing engineering. I thought it was so good. They had 64,000 processors going at really high speed. They could go through chess at millions of moves a second.
Between the first game and the second game, the computer was trained on lots and lots of Kasparov games. So it wasn't just becoming a good chess player, it was becoming tuned to playing against that particular person.
I was there actually at the time here in this building where the game was actually, where the machine was and where the machine was invented, and I was working on the systems aspects of it. It was search algorithms, but search algorithms that were intelligent from the point of view of thinking about one move versus other.
Over a series of 3 chess matches, Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov. It outmaneuvered, outthought, and outplayed the greatest chess grandmaster of his day. Artificial intelligence had burst out of its winter and now looks set to blaze a revolutionary trail.
Garry Kasparov has resigned the position.
That was a really key moment, wasn't it, when IBM's Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov?
To me, that it still gives me goosebumps with respect to what we broke through at that point in time. It was the pinnacle of intelligence for anybody to be able to play chess at the level that a grandmaster will play. And beating the grandmaster itself is I think its importance cannot be overstated. But the capabilities that went into it brought together algorithms, infrastructure, which is hardware, and data. Sort of 3 of these aspects came together at that point, and I would say it was the precursor to our latest wave of AI.
IBM had built Deep Blue using the established expert systems model of AI. The chess victory over Kasparov was its greatest achievement to date. But to beat a person at a game involving set patterns and strategy was one thing. Beating humans at a game of general knowledge was another.
The next big landmark in the public imagination was IBM's Watson. That was a machine that could play Jeopardy. Jeopardy's a game in the United States where you give the answer to a question, and then people have to try and work out what the question is.
It became clear you couldn't win a game like Jeopardy by just building an expert thing in each category. There's just too much. So they started moving to a different direction, and they brought together a bunch of people eventually from all parts of the company.
By 2011, IBM engineers were working with new tools. One key challenge was understanding human language. Using advancements in the new field of natural language processing, they built layer upon layer of algorithms, mathematical structures that allowed the machine to learn human language through a mass input of data.
Language and communication is the essence of us as being human beings. It's one of the hardest tasks and hardest barriers for AI to have crossed after we did well on games.
This U.S. president negotiated the Treaty of Portsmouth, ending the Russo-Japanese War. Watson.
Who is Theodore Roosevelt?
Good for $800.
What IBM did was they played the best players in the world. They made a TV game of the players who had done the best, the 2 very top players, and beat them. live on TV.
IBM's Watson computer, like Deep Blue, had triumphed in the battle between human and machine. But unlike Deep Blue, Watson was not strictly an expert system. Its novelty was machine learning, a branch of artificial intelligence that had been driven underground decades earlier.
The machine learning side, it almost died out. But from 90s on, when you started having the internet and all these digital devices and mountains of data, and you started feeding this huge amount of data to these machine learning systems, they were uncannily effective.
Far from being abandoned, machine learning had continued developing away from the mainstream of artificial intelligence. Alongside technological advancements, personal computers, laptops, mobile phones, high-speed microchips. And then came the World Wide Web, search engines, tech giants, social media, smartphones. Machine learning now had the two ingredients it had always needed: massive computer processing power and data. Masses and masses of data. Machine learning was now set to take off. The United States government has been seeking to use machine learning to isolate targets for drone attack for many years, because I'm afraid we Americans have a bit of a tin ear for irony. It calls its program Skynet, in which it is going to seek to try and find targets for attack. When we talk about AI and warfare, the other thing I want to be clear about is this isn't about the Terminator, right? This isn't about killer robots. What I want to talk to you about is humans and targeting and the way that human intelligence analysts relate to information that comes out of semi-automated processes. Basically, from people's cell phone metadata, we try to determine their so-called pattern of life, where they're going, who they know, and who they talk to. Here's the problem, I think, that the United States has, right? The NSA learned to collect it all well before they were able to understand it all. Faster is faster. Absolutely, machine learning and artificial intelligence would permit the Defense Department to accelerate the process of target selection, but faster ain't always better.
I want to make sure that people understand actually drones have not caused a huge number of civilian casualties.
For years, the drone wars were an open secret in Washington, but it wasn't until 2012 that President Obama officially acknowledged the program.
For the most part, they have been very precise, precision strikes against al-Qaeda.
But that was the same year we started to hear about signature strikes, where the CIA or the Defense Department would target not a name or an identity, but essentially a phone.
This is a targeted, focused effort at people who are on a list of active terrorists.
They would collect signals data, especially telephone data, and put it through a secret algorithm. They would decide you were a threat based on who you talked to, where you went, who your friends were. But that's not precise. At best, it's an educated guess. So I started to wonder, what if Faisal's brother-in-law and his nephew were killed because of an algorithm?
My name's Ed Snowden. I'm 29 years old. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton as an infrastructure analyst for NSA.
In 2013, Edward Snowden blew the whistle on the U.S. National Security Agency's mass surveillance program. He revealed that foreign intelligence gathering tactics were now being deployed at home, casting a nationwide net to catch a few bad fish.
So while they may be intending to target someone associated with a foreign government or someone that they suspect of terrorism, they're collecting your communications to do so.
A year later, Michael Hayden, the former director of the CIA and NSA, stopped short of disclosing the Skynet program's existence, but admitted that targets were being identified for so-called signature strikes using metadata collected from everyday communications.
We kill people based on metadata.
The signature strike would be selecting someone who looks like other people that you think are the people you're looking for. You know, one critique of this is demography is destiny in some sense.
So we can't know, because of the nature of the beast, right, exactly whether Skynet was ever used. But it seems likely to me that given what we've said about signature strikes, that some kind of algorithmic targeting process is being used to isolate targets in places like Yemen and Pakistan, using partly signals intelligence.
To be clear, we have no evidence that that model was ever used in practice. I would be shocked if it isn't being used. Machine learning is pretty good at finding elements from a huge pool of non-elements.
When President Obama took over the so-called war on terror, he favored drones because they meant fewer boots on the ground. And as the drone wars expanded, the method of selecting targets changed. Metadata was now a key source of intelligence, but there was far too much of it for human analysts to process. So machine learning would be used to identify targets and sift the good guys from the bad. At least, that was the idea.
Machine learning is good at this problem called binary classification. So is someone part of a terrorist network or are they not part of a terrorist network? Machine learning is also pretty good at asymmetric problems where there are very, very few things you're looking for in a sea of things you're not looking for. A few people who are part of terrorist networks in a sea of civilians, for example.
So where do you think the kind of statistical targeting is likely to go wrong?
Humans do binary classification all the time. Okay? We have to decide if we're looking at a bunch of, for example, a bunch of dogs at the dog park, and which ones are dangerous and which ones aren't. When we say, no, that dog is not dangerous, but it is, that's called a false negative. If we made a mistake. We can go the other way. We can have a false positive. Oh my gosh, that dog's really dangerous, but it's not. So people might take action on those false positives, and we'll get innocent people killed. I'm also worried about false negatives. The thing about machine learning is that it assumes that the future is like the past. It assumes that the things it's looking for in its prediction are like the things that it saw in the training round. So if we have a problem where people are actively trying to disguise their activities, then a machine learning model is likely to make a lot of false negative mistakes. It's going to miss a lot of people who are likely terrorists. That said, I'm not sure that there's any other way to do it, but the risks are very substantial. And almost certainly, mistakes that lead to people's deaths are going to happen here.
We always knew the strike on Faisal's family was a mistake. We met congressmen, we talked to senators, we even spoke to people in the White House National Security Council. But while everyone expressed regret for Faisal's loss, no one could explain why it happened or how it happened. My client, Faisal bin Ali Jaber's brother-in-law and nephew, were two victims among hundreds caught up in the American drone war in Yemen. While Yemenis protested the loss of civilian lives, few knew that these were victims of computerized targeting, built on data gleaned from phones and surveillance apparatus, fed into algorithms, and narrowed down from possible terrorist to probable terrorist to definite terrorist. Neither Faisal's brother-in-law or nephew was a terrorist. As a human rights lawyer, I had been investigating civilian casualties in drone attacks in Yemen and Pakistan, and over time we came to understand that the people we worked with who'd lost loved ones were killed as a result of a semi-automated, algorithmic targeting process. And there was a kind of article that came out about an NSA slide deck that said, well, this is how we're going to use machine learning to find and isolate targets in Pakistan. And somebody phoned you up as a statistician and asked for your take on this, and you were like, well, look, this is just totally unsound.
Yeah, it was pretty unsound.
I mean, is it just basically kind of racial profiling at scale? How do you see it?
Well, it's more complicated than that, because the kind of information that we're working with in that case is telephony metadata. The problem in that particular example that the NSA analysts were trying to figure out was, okay, we've identified, the CIA had identified a small number of people who were couriers for terrorist organizations, who were carrying around flash drives and messages among groups of the terrorist organization they worked with. And the question is, can you use the phone calls that these people make and the places that their phones check in with the cells?
Assuming we've got those people right. But anyway, please continue.
I think that I'm willing to believe that they got these people right. The question is, how many more are there that they didn't get?
Yeah.
But can we use these people's information to disambiguate them, to tell the difference between these people and all the other people in the city they live in? Can you tell how different they are, so that you can just use the telephony metadata to predict which of the people who we know are terrorist couriers actually are terrorist couriers, and how few other people can you include in that list? Okay, so how few false positives can you get in that classification? And I was very skeptical about the particular model that was used in that case.
Sophia, do you see some resonances here? You know, we're talking about communities abroad who we've basically designated a threat, and then targeting them for armed attack. Does that chime at all with some of the policing and other targeting of communities of color in the States that you've studied?
You know, I resist the temptation to kind of essentialize these as the same in every part of the world, in every context. We do know, though, that technologies that predate these kinds of automated technologies about classifying and figuring out who might be a threat disproportionately are targeting people who might have politics that are, say, more to the left, people who are more interested in civil rights, people who are advocates of human rights, labor organizers, for example. So I think the question is, again, always underneath these projects are the values and the politics of who's being assessed, who's being classified, for what purposes. And those are fundamental questions that are going to be with us even with the next version of the technology.
Stop LAPD Spying Coalition did research on drones being deployed in LA. In 2015, they produced a report, and they actually drew very explicit lines between the use of drone technology in the Middle East and the proliferation of drone technology in police forces across the United States through the Urban Area Security Initiative. And they have been making these connections, right? The militarization of the police, the increase in third-party private services that are bought by public institutions.
So how do you see it? The defense community affecting the development of these technologies, is that the kind of original sin of the thing?
I think that particularly in academic contexts, the big chunks of funding have been for decades and continue to be from defense. I don't think that most of the funding that comes out of the defense establishment that's for pure research looks like it's going to be used to kill people. The larger problem is that it creates a kind of philosophical or even ideological framework that it's okay to produce things for the defense establishment, and that it makes sense to produce things for law enforcement because they're here to help us. That failure of having a critical understanding of what military and police institutions do to the communities that are on the receiving end of their business, I think that's the larger problem.
The resonance I kind of see, and the reason I guess I asked the question as somebody who did work with those communities in Yemen and Pakistan, is that they talk about feeling scrutinized and over-policed and contained in a way that I hear when I hear you guys talk about these other communities at the sharp end of the policing. So it's almost as if the language that comes out of them that says, we feel our whole community are suspect, it's never pointed, is it, at white-collar crime? The containment, the prediction, the assessment, always seems to be at a community who we fear in some way and that we want to contain.
Well, and who the we is in that is very important because we also don't profile and track, for example, white supremacists, Nazis, neo-Nazis in the same way. We don't talk about them as domestic terrorists, for example, in the US or in other countries. So the framing of who is the threat is ultimately always the value question, I think, that's on the table that we have to be thinking about. And of course, the more you automate the profile of who the threat is, who the threatening other is, the more you flatten these conversations about values, the harder it is to actually talk about what people are struggling for, what struggles for justice around the world look like.
I mean, and then some of the very companies who develop these technologies expand into other areas, don't you? So you've got Palantir, the security and intelligence firm who developed tools for counterinsurgency in Iraq, then sold some of their kit to the LAPD, recently inking a deal with the UN World Food Program, seeking to help them spot fraud. I mean, where does it end?
It makes you think math knows no context, right? We can sell our product anywhere, as long as we're finding a statistical relationship.
People can take 500 pictures to get that perfect shot, which is something when I was 20 could not have done because it would have been on film and listen, you got what you got.
Vast swathes of the world with cameras on smartphones, billions hooked up to social media, sharing images online, gave machine learning engineers access to a massive data, billions of images. These images could now be used to train algorithms to teach themselves to detect particular features, recognize particular forms. This new breakthrough was called deep learning. Very soon, AI would use deep learning to teach itself to recognize the form of a cat just by looking at millions of cat images on the internet. From there, it made the leap to recognizing people. Artificial intelligence now claimed the ability to pick out a specific face in a busy crowd, to find the needle in the haystack.
So what you have in front of you is a very typical surveillance scene. So it's a camera looking at a public street, and people will clearly walk past the camera. Facial recognition's got to work out that it's seen a person, and then it's got to work out what that person's face is, and it's got to take a biometric hash of that face, in essence, something that it can compare against the watch list. If there is a match, then that will alert and you'll see that come up on the screen. So that person is known to the system, has been identified. Clearly, you can set your system up to alert the right people when that happens.
Right, so if you wanted to kind of test it out on my face, for example, how would we make that happen?
So very simply, we would have a surveillance photograph, or it could be something taken from social media or just from the internet. That will be loaded into the watch list, as you can see here, such that if you walk past a camera that is linked to that watch list, then you should be detected, note that you have been seen, and then send an alert to the appropriate place.
Should we give it a try?
Let's do that.
All right.
You've got a crowded street scene, lots of people coming towards the camera. Each time the camera detects that it's seen a person, then it will biometrically hash that person and see if they're on the watch list. So if you can see here, for example, there's clearly a face, it's unknown, let's check that person against the watch list, they're not on it, there consequently that person is ignored, so it's as if the camera hasn't seen them at all. The facial recognition engine is working hard right now, checking out all of these people, and then clearly you're coming now towards the screen, and just a partial view of your face, and it immediately catches who you are. It will continue to identify you. The level of confidence will change depending on your angle to the camera, but at the minute it's got you in one single frame, and clearly you're on the list.
These facial recognition technologies should not exist. For what purpose are they being brought into existence? Again, who are they being pointed at? And what kinds of protections should we have against them?
A common critique of it is, well, it doesn't see black faces very well. But is that the whole problem with facial recognition?
I think for the people like Joy Buolamwini, their position would be these technologies exist and black people will be ensnared in them, especially black women. The failure rate is greatest on black women. Are going to be misread by these technologies and therefore potentially harmed because they will not be able to kind of fight back against these technologies that are pointed at them.
Joy Buolamwini of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology showed how facial recognition programs were unable to recognize black faces, particularly the faces of black women. The problem was data and bias. Engineers, who were mostly white males, trained algorithms with a data set of images that were themselves overwhelmingly of white males. The resulting algorithms struggled to recognize non-white, non-male faces. The algorithms simply couldn't compute what they saw with what they'd been trained on. The same racial and gender bias that existed in the wider world was trained into the system itself. One of the other key parts of the debate has to do with the extent to which the technology works on different faces. So whether it's as effective on people of color or women, is that changing? Does it kind of depend on the technology?
It absolutely depends on the core algorithm and how it's trained. So our technology, for example, we have trained it on different demographics in different parts of the world, but certainly in terms of if you step right back, kind of strip that debate away, the underlying artificial intelligence is kind of vanilla. It can be trained in any which way. It can clearly be trained to not have any inherent biases within it.
One of the sharpest growth areas of artificial intelligence that is being acquired by government authorities all over the world at the moment is, of course, facial recognition, right? Have you got some concerns about this technology? Do you think it's a good idea to be able to pick faces out of crowds, or could it end badly?
The question is how much more is gained, I think, by using facial recognition in terms of who's it deployed toward and in service of what. One of the things we find is that often facial recognition technologies are argued for around law enforcement or terrorism. Do we have the data yet that says this is radically impacting reducing terrorism? Is it working as a deterrent, an effective deterrent for people to engage in crime?
The assumption underneath is very strong, which is that we know who we're looking for. And I think that's a very difficult to prove assumption from the point of view of law enforcement. There's a lot of other mechanisms like this where massive data gathering helps law enforcement only in the aftermath, not so much in the prevention. If you capture every piece of information about all the video in a city after crime's been committed, that may help you solve the crime. It gives you very little ability to prevent the crime, and I suspect this will be quite similar.
So the predictive power of it is in no way certain, right? We just don't know. And meanwhile, there are these concerns about who it can see, who it can't see, bias. So there are some researchers, Joy Buolamwini and others, who basically have shown that it can't really see, at least at the moment, it can't see black faces. Is that a problem? Or is that one of several problems?
It actually sees black women's faces the least effectively. And so, of course, we want to make sure that there's accuracy, especially if these things are used, again, to go make an arrest of someone and being used as the so-called science that legitimates that arrest. And I think this is one of the reasons why those researchers are trying to pursue better accuracy, higher accuracy. I think there are others who would say, why are we legitimating facial recognition technologies? We should actually be resisting them at every level. I'd probably fall a little bit more along those lines and say, why do we need these technologies? Who are they being pointed toward, and why are they being trained on vulnerable communities in particular?
There's a big question. Why would we want to be included in these facial recognition technologies when they're doing harm to specific communities? And what it makes me think of is, are we in an era where errors are one of the ways in which we protest these systems over which we have no control? Yeah. Because right now it doesn't seem like we have that many mechanisms in place. There's no coordinated system by which we can protest or abolish certain kinds of systems or prevent them from being developed, right? So errors, noise, that sort of thing, that seems increasingly like an area for fruitful discovery for civil disobedience.
The larger question of what we're trying to accomplish as a society is the issue here. And the technology makes it somewhat explicit. If one of the things we think we want is law enforcement seeing everything that happens in our society with video covering every square, every inch of the public square and facial recognition, identifying every person wandering through that, is that the society we want to live in? It's not the society I want to live in. I think that's a terrible world.
And there's something intimate about the face in particular, isn't there? I feel like we're only just starting to clock the ways that the data is gathered about all of us, but I feel that people instinctively understand and have a lot of unease about their face being collected.
Absolutely. Thinking about Detroit, earlier this year, the city announced that it would be upping the number of surveillance cameras that it's putting into the downtown area. So that number will reach 500 after a 5-year mark. And this is an area of Detroit that's meant to be redeveloped, and you know, all sorts of changes are taking place. And there are a number of community members that are really upset about this because they feel these cameras won't be only used for so-called security purposes. They'll be used for other kind of this mission creep idea that it will start to affect how people socialize with one another.
And it's not just the public square, is it, right? We see big kind of box stores, Walmart and others starting to test these facial recognition software. They say, oh, well, we looked at it for shoplifters, but we're not going to use that. We just want to improve the customer experience. How comforted are you by that?
I'm not. I mean, I think that, again, even if it's not law enforcement that's using these technologies, but, you know, what does it mean that we're trading off our privacy, we're trading off a certain quality of life that we have come to rely upon to be ensnared in these systems so that these interoperable systems between companies can track my moves. And of course, they do this with our engagements on the internet and with our, you know, smart technologies in our pockets and in our bags.
I'm really concerned about that. I mean, that's much less as a technologist or as a scientist that worries me than as a civil libertarian. And in particular, I think about the restriction on our freedom to associate. If I associate with someone in the public square, do I then take on some of that person's implicit guilt? The point of these systems is to be modeling the level to which any of us should be subjected to additional law enforcement attention. That's explicitly the point. These techniques, these tools are to highlight who law enforcement needs to pay attention to.
There are plenty of people who will be watching this program who will say, well, we want to catch criminals and this does make me feel safer. But I think these technologies also get deployed in other ways, like using facial recognition software when you're in a job interview and answering questions and profiling your face and your emotions and deciding whether or not you are reliable or trustworthy, and having a machine, in fact, make a prediction about whether you'll be a great employee based on the kinds of facial gestures that you make. I mean, these kinds of things are being deployed right now. They're being tested in industry. And that says a lot. I mean, what the kind of statistical model of great employee facial gestures looks like, I think is incredibly subjective. It's cultural. It's not universal. It cannot be standardized. And yet we will see these things increasingly rolling out.
Technology that can pick my face out of a crowd of people may seem innocuous and even kind of impressive, but when you think about the consequences for millions of ordinary people, including really serious consequences, then the conversation looks a little different. Romford here in East London is one of the places where Metropolitan Police have been testing their live facial recognition technology, and the way that it works is pretty similar. A camera on this van here checks everybody who walks by against a database of known suspects. If the camera and the software find a match, then a person is stopped and searched and potentially arrested. London's Metropolitan Police has been trialing facial recognition technology since 2016. The UK capital already has the second highest concentration of CCTV cameras in the world. Only Beijing has more. It's why there's a reluctance among civil liberty groups like Liberty and Big Brother Watch to accept another layer of surveillance.
We asked for statistics for every time it's been used, and we found that 98% of their matches have inaccurately identified innocent members of the public as potentially wanted criminals.
98%?
Yes.
A lot of this inaccuracy is down to bad data. Poor quality images loaded into the algorithms, images often taken from low-grade CCTV footage. The technology is far from proven, and its use mired in controversy. That's why even a city like San Francisco, the home of tech, has banned facial recognition from being used by civic authorities, including the police. But in London, right now, there is no ban.
This isn't just catching images of people, it's an identity check. It subjects members of the public to a perpetual police lineup.
So what do you say when there's this comment made, well, actually, if we could get this technology right, then maybe it will reduce some of the complaints of bias policing and so forth?
Whether we're talking about humans eliminating discrimination or technology eliminating discrimination, there has to be the intent. And what we can see already with this experimental technology being used, it's never been tested for potential racial biases. There is no intent to test the technology and see how it's working and see how it's affecting people. So unfortunately, I don't think this is going to solve any of those problems.
Over the next few hours, we would see a number of arrests, but none, we were told, because of matches through facial recognition technology. These arrests were the result of old-fashioned police work. More officers on the beat, leading to more arrests. Just as the trial in Romford was about to end for the day, plain-clothed officers moved in to apprehend a man from a nearby fast food restaurant. His image had been flagged by the facial recognition technology. After police carried out identity checks, he was arrested. Artificial intelligence has come a long way since its early days of unfulfilled promise and shaky robots. But we're still far from building computers that can do all the things humans can do. And we're finding that machine learning can reflect some of our biases right back at us. In the next episode of The World According to AI, we'll explore the choice we all face. Will artificial intelligence be used to improve the lives of everyone, or to keep power and privilege where they already are?